After Kamala Harris's defeat in the 2024 presidential election, the finger-pointing on the Democratic side of the aisle on who was to blame began almost instantly. Given the relatively narrow loss and the huge number of variables at play, there was no shortage of targets. One broad dividing line was for the moderate conservative wing to blame the leftist left-leaning wing, and vice versa. Nowhere was this dividing line more stark than with the Uncommitted Movement. The Uncommitted Movement arose out of the Biden administration's policies regarding Israel's response to Hamas's attack on October 7, 2023, and Joe Biden's de facto unopposed run for a second term. And sure, there were technically other Democratic Party candidates, but the DNC had effectively pre-selected Biden as their nominee. For non-Americans, and frankly, many Americans, this is totally legit, though undemocratic. At least in the US, political parties as institutions are more like semi-private organizations and aren't actually government entities. So parties aren't violating the law when they put their thumb on the scale for a particular candidate during the primaries. But it is fair to criticize the system as undemocratic. Anyhow, given that Biden as the Democratic Party nominee was all but assured, a different approach was made by those opposed to Biden's policies regarding Israel. Starting in the state of Michigan, Waleed Shahid, Leila El-Abed, and Abbas Alaway pushed for a vote of uncommitted in the Michigan primary, hence how the movement got its name. When launched, their goal was 10,000 primary votes. Ultimately, uncommitted received over 100,000 votes, 13.2% of Michigan's Democratic primary total. With this success, similar actions were quickly organized in other Democratic primaries where voting uncommitted was an option, often netting around 10% of the vote, but in some places it was close to 20%, with its highest voting percentage in Hawaii at 29%. These vote totals did lead to the Biden administration meeting with community leaders, including Alaway. He expressed disappointment in this meeting and how senior Biden officials were not willing to meet their demands, which, when it came to the type of halting of support of Israel the Uncommitted Movement was aiming for, Alaway's reaction is totally understandable. Having said that, the Uncommitted Movement did have real effects on the Biden administration's policy towards Israel, small as they were. New weapons shipments weren't halted, but they were significantly delayed, with certain heavy ordnance blocked altogether. The Biden administration placed sanctions not only on Israeli settlers in the West Bank, some individuals, not literally all settlers, but also sanctions were placed on many of the illegal settlements for the first time in US history. These are genuine successes in altering US foreign policy, something that American voters actually have very little influence over. After Biden ultimately bowed out of the race and Kamala Harris took over in the run for president, El-Abed and Alaway met briefly with Harris at an early campaign event in Michigan, reportedly saying the movement would like to support her, but they wanted a commitment to an arms embargo on Israel first, a demand Harris and her campaign were not willing, and I would argue at the time, wasn't able to meet. Further tension between the Uncommitted Movement and Harris campaign specifically, and Democratic Party more broadly, took place at the Democratic National Convention. While the DNC included a Palestinian human rights panel during the convention, they ultimately rejected the movement's request for a speaker of Palestinian descent on the main stage. Following this, movement leaders called for Harris, or a senior campaign official, to meet with them by the 15th of September 2024 to discuss prospects for a ceasefire and arms embargo. When that deadline passed with no meeting, an official statement declared that the Uncommitted Movement would not endorse Harris for president in 2024. Over the coming weeks, notable splits took place between the national leadership of the Uncommitted Movement and its state branches. The official position of the Uncommitted Movement was that a Trump presidency would be a dire threat, and while not endorsing Harris, advocated for supporters to vote in a way to prevent Trump from winning the presidency, which did mean voting for Harris. Some state branches defied this message, instead endorsing a third-party vote. As the Massachusetts branch of the Uncommitted Movement put it, given the choice between genocide and fascism, we choose neither. After Harris' defeat in the November election, there were those that pointed to the Uncommitted Movement's failure to endorse Harris, and some state-level groups outright telling their supporters not to vote for Harris, as causing lower turnout and support in the general election. Now, in this cat's opinion, The only states where you can really make a strong argument this affected the outcome are Wisconsin and Michigan. And if those two states went Harris, that would not have been enough on their own to change the outcome. But I would be remiss if I didn't note Pennsylvania's Uncommitted Movement was one of the state-level operations that encouraged people to not vote for Harris in the general election, and to instead vote third party or leave the president blank. And while I personally do not believe this on its own would have impacted enough voters to change the outcome, if Pennsylvania as well as Michigan and Wisconsin had flipped, that would have changed the results of the election. But there is a different impact that I do believe the Uncommitted Movement had that shifted the results of the election, and it has to do with how the movement impacted the Harris campaign itself. But to explain that, I first have to explain how parties and politicians have historically operated when it comes to building voting coalitions. In an ideal world, political parties and politicians represent the will of the voters. But even in this ideal world, different voting groups will have differing priorities, or even want entirely different things. The party and politician will attempt to form a platform to appeal to enough people in order to win the election. Note, I did not say as many people as possible, but enough to win the election. Now, most parties and politicians are going to be okay with maximizing their number of voters, but they can run into a problem. If you have a particularly diverse coalition ideologically, as you try to expand that tent even further, you run the risk of alienating other parts of the coalition. Up until recently, one of the advantages that the Republican Party had over the Democratic Party was a relatively small ideological tent. They had managed to combine conservative, usually Christian, morals, low taxes, and individualism into a single ideology, which meant a relatively small combination of ideas gave them a relatively large number of votes. This advantage has fallen apart more recently in the age of Trump, but I point out that historical advantage to highlight the difficulty for the Democratic Party, whose tent now extends from liberal-minded fiscal conservatives to outright leftists. I can already hear many of you saying, but the Democratic Party doesn't need those fiscal conservative voters. If they just did more progressive policies, they would get more votes. And maybe that's true, but why would the Democratic Party change their policies for people that aren't currently voting for them? This is the default of how political parties and politicians operate when it comes to enacting policies. Aside from the ones that they are lobbied on, of course. They are far more likely to do something if the people that want that thing done are already voting for them, or if they have committed to voting for them. Yeah, I chose that word on purpose. In the political primaries, the Uncommitted Movement very cleverly used the uncommitted option on the ballot as a way to signal their dissatisfaction with the current administration on a major foreign policy issue. And they got some concessions out of it, which in foreign policy isn't nothing. That's really hard to do. Think about how effective the Vietnam War protests were at ending the Vietnam War. I'll give you a hint. The first large protests were in 1965. The war ended in 1973, a full 8 years later. Though in an echo of the Uncommitted Movement in 2024, the Vietnam War protests did contribute to the, at the time, President Lyndon B. Johnson dropping out of the race in 1968. Given the results of primary elections with uncommitted as an option, we can assume maybe 8%, plus or minus a few points, of the Democratic base was aligned sufficiently with the Uncommitted Movement. This was a major concern for them in the 2024 election. The critical error the movement made, in my opinion, was first signaling and then ultimately announcing a non-endorsement of Kamala Harris. This was an error because by not endorsing her for president, the Harris campaign would interpret that voting bloc as one that was not going to vote for her. Once a group has signaled they aren't going to vote for you, political parties or politicians will stop trying to get your vote. They will dedicate their time and energy towards people they know will vote. Beyond the political incentive structures at play, there is psychology that goes into this as well. The psychological element is beyond the scope of this video, but fortunately, friend of the channel Sage over at the Vivid Fae Garden has a video going into that aspect in more depth. Please check out her video after this one. It will be linked down below. The Uncommitted Movement's lack of endorsement and the incentives it would have for how the Harris campaign would respond is how the Uncommitted Movement indirectly and unintentionally hurt Harris for president. Strategists on Harris's team looked at how many people voted uncommitted, looked at the possibility Uncommitted wouldn't endorse Harris, given she wasn't willing to promise a weapons embargo on Israel, and concluded, we can't count on this 5 to 10% of the historical Democratic Party base. We need our campaign to focus appeal on other voters. Given there was heavy overlap with this section of the Democratic coalition and leftists, where was the Harris campaign going to look for more votes? The center-right. Now, I'm sure there was more to the relatively centrist campaign Harris ran than just the Uncommitted movement, but I believe this was a major contributing factor in determining the campaign's course in the weeks after the Democratic National Convention. Does this mean the Uncommitted movement gets the blame for Harris's defeat in 2024? No. The 2024 presidential election was very close, and there were an array of factors that collectively contributed to Trump's victory. Heck, I have another video on this channel talking about the state and perception of the 2024 economy that was a major focus of the presidential campaign. But there should be lessons learned here for how political movements can more effectively influence political parties, and that if a movement believes itself to be influential, acknowledging where they may have stumbled in wielding that influence.